this beautiful flag.
Hello and welcome back to Source Okay. This is a podcast created to learn, understand, and demystify life in Africa and African lives. Today, we're speaking louder about the rise of digital politics and social movement by the youth, specifically in Africa. Our guest today is a PhD student at the Queen Mary University of London. His research looks at the hashtag #EndSARS in Nigeria and the hashtag This Flag movement in Zimbabwe. It is a pleasure to have you on today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you, Zainab. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast. I'm super pumped for our conversation today. So my name's Nicholas, short Nick. Um, I'm a second year PhD candidate at the School of Politics and International Relations here at Queen Mary University of London. I'm doing my PhD in political science and I'm exploring issues around digital politics and social movements. Like you rightly shared, Zainab, I'm looking at two particular case studies from Nigeria and Zimbabwe.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so before we get into kind of like the meat of the topic, I want to kind of demystify some of the keywords that you might be using that people might not understand. So just to give us a introduction or definition of what is digital politics and what is social movement.
Okay, great question. Before I come to the question, though, I try to explain a bit of why I chose the two case studies I'm looking at because I think it will inform also a bit of answers to the questions that you just asked. I decided on picking these two case studies from Nigeria and Zimbabwe for a couple of reasons. The first off is the fact that these movements in Zimbabwe and in Nigeria are politically significant. And I mean that in terms of the importance that each of these movements have had in political structuring and the political circumstances of the countries in question, even after the protests happened. Secondly, I also choose these two cases because of recency. So they've happened within a 10-year period, and somewhat are still um, having overreaching effects in the political dynamics of the both countries in question. And then I pick on them because they also utilize a lot of symbolism. There in the NSAS protest, there was a symbol of the clenched fist, and in the This Flag protest, you saw the emergence of the symbol, national symbols of the Zimbabwean flag. And then lastly, I decided also to pick on them because of what one would rather describe as methods of difference and agreement. So there are points in each of these two protests that there are areas of agreement, and there are points that there are areas of dissimilarity. The areas of agreement would imply that a lot of these two protests latched onto digital platforms to grow and spread, and areas of dissimilarity are in terms of the structure of the protest. So NSAS was largely regarded as leaderless and decentralized. And then for this flag, on the other hand, you had the protest centered around the personality of a particular individual, in this case, Pastor Ivan Mawarire, who drove and spurred the protest on. Then to your questions, um, political identities for me implies I pick on the concept that's used by someone I reference a lot in my research, Charles Tilly, who was a British sociologist, and he regards identities as shared stories over time that people utilize in explaining some of the circumstances that affect them. And you can identify four different elements to each of these shared stories. First off is the identification of a boundary. So there's a me, you, or us, them boundary that exists. Secondly, there are a set of relations within the boundary and a set of relations across the boundary. And then there are stories about the boundary and these relations that exist. Now, these identities become political when the government is a party on any of these divides. So in the me, you, or us, them relationships. And so that's how you can easily understand political identities. So I'm framing them in terms of shared stories, which is critical, especially in my choice of symbols for each of these protest movements I'm exploring. Then social movements, on the other hand, are collective actions that are taken by non-traditional political institutions that are used to drive social change. So you can see a history of that in Africa. I think there's one author that tries to trace that history in three movements, three pivotal movements. There was the first pivotal movement around decolonization movement. So you see a lot of that in the 1960s, where you had a lot of nationalist sentiment and the quest for decolonization, the quest for unity around various countries in Africa. The second wave of social movements happened with the quest for democratic transitions, and this happened around the 1970s to the 1980s. And it was triggered a lot by the Sudanese movement, 1985 revolution, somewhat. So you see that 1970s, 1980s, and the 1990s were characterized a lot by these movements that emerged. And then the last set of movements, or the last wave of social movements, came around 2011 with the Arab Spring. And these crystallized a new set of movements that were driven on the back of the digital and technological transformations that were happening. And so it's from there that I pick up the story, particularly from 2016, when a lot of events around these two particular case studies I'm exploring began to happen.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Just to point out, I really liked the way you defined identity, and I've never heard it that way, which was really interesting. But if you think about it, we are all sharing the same similar story, but what makes you you is just slightly the difference between my story and your story. And so I really like that. But yes, to kind of go into the two movements, let's first dive into this flag movement, right? So just to give some context to the listener, on around the evening in April 2016, Ivan Mawarire made a 4-minute video and posted it on Facebook. So a simple act, but actually changed his entire life trajectory. The video that Mawarire pleads explained the troubles and the difficulties he was going through, and a lot of other people were going through in Zimbabwe, in southern Africa. It actually set off a chain of events, including a launch of major political movement and him being arrested and beaten multiple times. When he hit the post button in that video, Mawarire never dreamed it would ultimately lead him and his family to live in
The
exile
green
in
is
the
for the
United States.
vegetation and for the crops. I don't see any crops in my country. Anzi the yellow is for all the minerals, goride, diamonds, platinum, chrome. I don't know how much of it is left, and I don't know who they sold it to and how much they got for it.
So that's the context and the background. And as you mentioned earlier, the NSAS doesn't really have one leader, right? But however, this flag, that's the differences, has one main person that kind of started this movement. So from your research, can we talk a little bit more about this flag movement? Yeah, what were the main findings really from the social movement and political identities that you found?
Okay, thank you, Zainab. To put a bit of context to this, my research is utilizing mixed methods to examine these political phenomena across these two case studies. And what that implies is that on the one hand, I'm using quantitative analysis, and here I'm breaking that down into further into social network analysis to look at the growth and spread of the network on online digital platforms. In this case, I picked Twitter, particularly because Twitter is a microblogging platform that is renowned or notorious for its political strength and political conversations that go on it. So what I'm doing is exploring on the quant side how these networks are constituted as communities, the function and importance of information and disinformation as well in the spread of the movement. And I'm looking at key actors within each of these movements. So on the one hand, I have nodes that represent users on these on the Twitter platform. And then I have edges or the ties that are represented either as retweets or as mentions. And with that, I'm able to map out the network as it looks like. And in that stead, how the community around these grows. So I'm using, not to be too technical, but I'm using the Louvain community detection algorithm to look at ways of detecting communities within these tweets. I have a total of about 200,000 tweets across both cases that I'm using to do my research and to investigate further how this is growing. And then I'm building out a diffusion model to predict how the movement would have grown and what kind of shape it would take in terms of centrality, in terms of modularity as well. So these are some of the things I'm doing on the quant side. And then on the qual side, which is the qualitative side of things, I'm interviewing activists that were at the forefront of these protests. And some of the key activists, as well as some of some activists who were bridges in the network, who functioned as critical nodes to pass on information to enable the network to grow. So these are some of the things that I'm doing. And I say this so that it helps to put some context to the work that I'm doing, because I'm still at very early stages. So I'm currently doing my quant analysis around the network and looking at how that has grown. But in relation to your question, which is around this flag and what I've seen so far, what I've realized from my investigation of both cases so far is that social movements are not just flashes in the pan. They sort of build up over time. And significantly, you can point out a proximate moment in time when they sort of emerge, but there are also remote points in time when the protest sort of starts to build momentum. In the case of this flag, if you look through Zimbabwean history, you see before 2016, before April 2016, Zimbabwe was experiencing significant socioeconomic and political upheaval. There were challenges in terms of opposition politics. So there was the ZANU PF, which is also still till now the dominant political party in the country, and then opposition around the MDC emerged to counter a lot of the politics of the incumbent party. And so there was a lot of somewhat political instability in terms of where the country was headed. This was also strengthened or even exacerbated by the socioeconomic difficulties that Zimbabwe was experiencing at the time. So a lot of these things sort of created um, a tense bubble of, of pressure, of angst, social anxiety that I think were needed for Moharire's outburst to really strike at nerves. So Moharire's video called, he had the flag draped around his shoulders, and then he spoke in very emotive and very endearing terms about nationhood. He pointed to some of the symbols of the flag, the yellow color of within the flag, implying the mineral richness of Zimbabwe, the red implying the blood of fallen heroes, of those that participated in the Chimurenga, which is like the nationalist struggle of Zimbabwe. So these things, I think, struck deep chords within a lot of Zimbabweans, and you could see a lot of people posting videos later on with the flag around their shoulders as well in support. So I think these were factors that sort of built up to that singular moment in time and offered leverage for um, Nawarire's words to really have significant effect, in the political landscape there in Zimbabwe.
Mhm. Do you think that if it wasn't on social media, if there wasn't any social media platform, do you think his words would have still had the same impact?
That is a bit difficult to say. What I'd rather say is I think that if social media were not present, his words would not have had a wider reach as it did have. In terms of impact, impact is often a difficult hill to die on because when I started my research too, I was a bit conflicted around looking at impact or outcomes, because sometimes you see that these protests happen, and at the end of the protest cycle, there's no palpable impact or palpable outcome from the protest. So I feel that social media helped in terms of amplification rather. So latching onto the digital was very helpful and instrumental in having a wider reach, in connecting with people that would ordinarily have not come, would not have come across that message. I think there's just to go through this point before I stop on that. There's some research done by Granovetter on the strength of weak ties. And what he says is that strong ties often bring the same information. So you have friends that are very familiar with. You realize that they just give you know the information that they're already going to give you because you interact with them on a daily. However, weak ties are often sources of new information. So people you've not been in contact with for a long time, and suddenly you're in contact with them, you get new information from them. And that's what social media does somewhat because you have very weak ties based on followership or retweeting or mention behaviors on social media platforms. And you see that through that means you can get new information, you can get access to new information. And so there's the compounding effect that comes from spreading or sharing information online, which I think social media does help.
Actually, on that word of impact, actually, I we won't go into it now. However, there is a section later which I do want to talk about the impact and is there any tangible difference in impact. But now I want to actually go into the NSARS movement, right? And give the listener again some context. In 1992, the Special Anti-Robbery Squad SARS, an arm of the Nigerian police force, was set up to deal with the rise in violent crimes. But since its inception, the unit has been linked to extrajudicial killings, torture, and widespread abuse. On October the 8th, people took to the street to demand an end to the brutality.
harassment, extortion, and killings. Nigerian police force, we done too much. We are not here for the South, but the entire Nigerian police force should be reformed.
Similar question to this flag. Through your research, what are some of the key things you found? How has the community built? Like, since it didn't start from one key person like this flag, what are some of the differences that you spotted?
Yes, thank you. Again, like this flag, in the case of this flag, um, the NSAS movement, unlike a lot of people seem to be familiar with, did not just start in October 2020. It had built up over time. And interestingly, it also started within the same year that I would argue that it started around the same time that this flood happened as well. It started in 2016, and it started off with a report by Amnesty International, and the report was titled, "You have signed your death warrant." And it was a report on some of the atrocities that were ongoing within the SARS unit in the police force. This report detailed about 58 cases of subjects that were subjected to torture, to rape, and different forms of abuse by the SARS unit, and was published online. Now, people got acquainted with this report, and there was public outcry. And interestingly, even the vice president then, Vice President Osibanjo, set up a committee to investigate and look into these crimes and deal with them. So there was, I think, a committee set up, I think, in 2017 to investigate all of these crimes, to look into them critically. Around that time, also, the hashtag first emerged, the hashtag NSAS in 2017. And it emerged with about 100,000 tweets on that, with a lot of public outcry on what was happening. And then, even interestingly, even around that time too, the hashtag ProSARS also emerged, which was sort of to counter NSARS. And even though it did not garner up as much interest as the hashtag NSARS did in 2017, that went on for a while. And because a lot of these investigations did not reap significant fruits, in 2020, around June, the Amnesty International published another report on SARS again. And this time, I think the report was titled "Time to End Impunity." And it detailed over 85 cases or thereabout of further infractions of human rights within SARS from 2017 to 2020. So this happened, and then while all this was happening, 3rd of October came, and there was the online post on Twitter of a video showing SARS officials killing a particular resident in Ughelli, Delta State. And it sort of sparked up national angst and outcry on that. And instead of the officials to retract or find a way to deal with the situation, they arrested the individual that made the post. And that led to, I think, 8 October was where everything like spilled to a climax. Everyone went online with indignation and disgust at the atrocities committed. And then we had the series of events that led to the Tollgate issue, the Tollgate massacre. So what I think is significant here is, from both case studies, is for one, you see that the protest was driven strongly by an individual, that was in this flag, the case of this flag, and the charisma of that particular individual, I think, was critical to the success of the movement's growth and spread. And then in the other case, you have protest movement that's somewhat leaderless and decentralized. I say somewhat because there are still elements of centralization that still exist even within the NSAS case. You have clusters of groups that one could say were leading the narrative, leading the impetus and direction of the movement through narrative building and other things online. So there are clusters of those groups, but there's no significant individual at the helm of the situation, or at the helm of the entire issue. So I think that's one significant difference that one could see between NSAS and this flag. Then secondly, a lot of scholars theorize that every social movement has 4 points in its life cycle. There's the emergence of the social movement. Um, then, after the emergence, you have coalescence, where the movement realizes that to continue growing, it needs to have clear structures of how to recruit people into its ranks. It needs also clarity in terms of goals and objectives. And that's where you start seeing protest objectives coming out, and protest demands and all of that. And then the third point of the life cycle is often the difficult part, and that's where you have bureaucratization or institutionalization. So at this point, the government or whoever that's on the receiving end decides to start to initiate conversations. And while there may not be full democratization of a social movement, there are certain for a social movement to somewhat persist. There need to be some elements of bureaucratization. What it implies is at some point one needs to sit on the negotiating table and discuss with others on the other side of the table. And then the last bit is decline. So what I think happened was with NSAS, I'm still yet to see a lot of interesting things with the data that I'm looking at. But with NSAS, I think there are frictions around the third stage and a lot of difficulty with navigating that stage, particularly also because they're wearing faces to the protest. On the one side, not having faces to a protest is actually very good. It implies that because most people feel that the moment you can cut off the head of the hydra, that you can invariably kill that protest movement. So they look for those that are faces to the protest, and then they sort of remove the power that they have, or prevent them from exerting influence on their members, and in that way they're able to quell the protest. So I think there was a difficulty around navigating that because at some point you still need to negotiate. You need to talk at the negotiating table with whoever is on the other side of the conversation. And to do that effectively, you need some representation. So there needs to be some level of bureaucratization that will help that movement to proceed on. And I think there are difficulties around that. But nonetheless, these things are still very interesting because even in the Kenyan case that just happened recently, they were able to navigate these challenges without needing to have faces to the protest.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for that clarity, clarifying it. So yeah, I said that I wanted to talk about impact and you've mentioned that these two were not just kind of small protests, these were very big and they had political they were amplified politically, and it wasn't just online, it was also in real life, and it did make a change. However, what was the real impact? Do you think that there was a reading through some articles and they've actually explained that I think there was there was this positive feeling and optimism that technology is going to bring a new type of dimension of liberalism, free speech, and it will allow people to be more politically involved and have more of a political impact. Do you think this is the case, or has technology really just kind of made a shift and really political leaders are still very restrictive and have put in place a lot of restriction on free speech and really is still the same um, as before social media and without, because the real impact is still not there?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's often a difficult question for me because I've come across this question a lot talking about my research. And I think I take the very contestable view that social media is making significant impact. And I say so without being ignorant of the challenges that emerge with the use of social media, especially in our day and age where you have AI and its impact on disinformation and even the muzzling of free speech on social platforms. I'm quite aware of that. But I say this because I think technology is changing the way that we behave. And you see a lot of this in not just, startups and um, businesses, but also in the political space. The way we engage with governments, with institutions, is significantly changing. These days, one has an issue and goes online and trends with a hashtag to address an issue. So I think it's changing the way people behave. And in that way, that's something significant. In the past, there was talk around the public space, and the public space here entailing traditional media and a lot that's happening in terms of civic engagement. So I think if you look at it from that angle, you realize that things have changed significantly. In my research, I also look at something that's happening in Africa. Africa is currently the youngest continent globally. Over 60%, more than 60% of populations in the African continent are below 25 years. And that's a strong point because you also look at the fact that a lot of these young people are utilizing every day smartphones, digital technology in their everyday engagements. So you see, sometimes they frame them as the mobile middle, and a good number of them are in the middle class. So they're like a middle class that's growing in terms of economic ability to sustain themselves economically, and then also very savvy with digital technologies. And this is creating something different, especially on the African continent. So in other places, yes, people are researching around what's happening in the digital space and how it's relating to things within politics. But I think it's also very unique, particularly unique in Africa because of that mobile middle, that section of young people that are increasingly being politically conscious and interested in changing society, in changing the state of affairs of their countries and being engaged. And where some people would have some arguments against saying that, oh, well, they don't really feel that the youth are as involved in politics as they should be. I think that there is some move towards where we want to be or where we should be. So in that scale, I think there's some significant impact. However, on the other side, in terms of the impact of each of these movements, I'm a bit skeptical, particularly because while a lot of the activists are planning and plotting and trying to drive social change, on the other side, some of those on the divide also have their agents to weaponize confusion somewhat. So they're in a lot of these spaces and pushing disinformation and trying to change the narrative. So you find that the struggle, which would have been offline, is also happening online now. And here it creates a dynamic in terms of what's happening with the impact of a lot of these protest movements. Whether they're making any real impact or not is contestable. And like I shared earlier, and I decided not to look at that, even though it's important to consider that, because the purpose of every movement is actually to effect social change.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you so much. Just to kind of round up on that, I do really think and commend your research that you're doing, and I do think it's really important to see this because, like you've said, the youth in Africa and especially with technology is definitely going to be the future, and I think politics and the future is going to be shaped by this a lot. What is kind of like one action point or one thing that you would like the listener to take away and remember or work towards having listened to you today?
I think one key thing that the reason why I'm doing all of this um, is particularly because I wish I envision a continent where the young people become more involved in the political life of their countries. I envision a continent where citizen engagement is wide reaching, is deep, and is effective. And this is because true democracy cannot come in a vacuum. It needs to come through dialogue. For growth to happen, conflict. Now, conflict here may not necessarily mean violence. Conflict here could imply ideas, ideas meeting each other and arriving at new ideas, arriving at sort of the emergence of synthesis. So, where thesis and antithesis meet, synthesis emerges, which is a new thesis, which is a new ideas born out of conflict. So for true democracy to happen, citizens need to be more engaged in the life of the polis, which is the city. That's where the concept of politics emerges. So they need to be more engaged in the life of the city, what's happening in and around them. And given that Africa is largely populated by young people, I think it defeats itself that a lot of the politics that happens in African countries is largely led and driven not by the young people. I think that's something that should be corrected. I think that the young people need to awaken to this responsibility and take the bull by the horns. And I'm happy to see a bit of that in various parts of Africa. You see that in Kenya over these past few months, in Kenyan youths rising up to the challenge to demand for what they know is their rights, their inalienable rights. So I think these are key things that I want my research to really do, to really make impact in, to see how to enhance civic engagement.
My deepest thanks goes to Nick, whose expertise and insight shaped this episode. Thank you very much for joining. You'll find references to articles and clips used in this episode in the description. If you made it this far, consider rating and following the podcast, and please do share it out with your community. It really means a lot. Sorosoke is an independent production brought to you by yours truly, Zainab Suman. Join us next time as we speak louder about the representation of Africa in the media.